Researchers find repeated link between volcanic eruptions and the dynastic collapse in China's Imperial era. This is by Trinity College, Dublin. Volcanic eruptions may have triggered abrupt climate changes and contributing to the repeat collapse of Chinese dynasties over the past 2,000 years, according to new research. It illustrates how volcanic eruptions can profoundly impact vulnerable or unstable regions and highlights the need to prepare for future eruptions. Volcanic eruptions may have triggered abrupt climate changes and repeated collapse of Chinese dynasties. It illustrates how they can profoundly impact vulnerable, unstable regions. The research combines historic evidence with polar ice core records of volcanic eruptions. Jointly, historians and environmentalist scientists from Trinity College Dublin and Zhejiang University of China worked on this research, published in Communications, Earth and Environment. Scientists identified explosive volcanic eruptions as one of the most important drivers of dramatic changes in the climate. It was often triggered sudden cooling and drying that caused livestock deaths and crop damage. They said our understanding of the role played by such abrupt climate shocks in state or societal collapse has been limited by the precision and accuracy of dating of available historic and climate evidence. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box. Dr. Francis Ludlow, Associate Professor of Medieval Environment History at Trinity, who jointly led the study, said, China has a remarkably long and richly documented history of multiple ruling dynasties, including major world powers like the Tang dynasty. It collapsed in the year 907 AD, or the Ming dynasty, which collapsed 1644. With so many precisely dated collapses, we can look not just at individual cases of collapse that may or may not have followed a change in climate, but rather look simultaneously at many collapses to see whether there is a repeated pattern where a change in climate was followed by a collapse. And this can tell us whether climate change played a very minor role in dynastic collapse, or whether it posed a systematic threat to these powerful and sophisticated societies. The study compared the dates of volcanic eruptions from ice core measurements of sulfate deposited on the polar ice sheets with the dates known for historical records of Chinese dynasties collapses across the first 2 millennia of the Common Era, that is 2000 AD. This exercise found that 62 of the 68 dynastic collapses were closely preceded by at least one volcanic eruption. John Matthews, postdoctoral fellow at Trinity Center for Environmental Humanities and co-author of the paper, said, researchers have identified a lot of historic eruptions through sulfate deposits in the polar ice. So we expect that some collapses will have preceded the eruptions purely by chance. To convince ourselves that we were seeing something significant, we ran the numbers and found that there would be just a 0.05% chance of seeing so many collapses preceded by so many eruptions if that had actually happened randomly. And the study showed a repeated link between volcanic eruptions and these dynastic collapses in China. Some dynasties, the author said, withstood numerous large eruptions before eventually succumbing, suggesting that the role of volcanism in collapse is far from straightforward and that dynasties were often resilient to sudden volcanic triggering and climate shocks. To gain further insight, the researchers assessed the role of explosive volcanism in tandem with other sources of stress or instability that a dynasty might experience by examining levels of warfare prevailing in the decades before collapse. Warfare was found to be elevated before most collapses, but the study also revealed a strong link between the magnitude of the volcanic climate shock and the level of pre-existing stresses. We found that even a small volcanic eruption might help trigger a collapse when pre-existing instability was high. Larger eruptions, however, could trigger a collapse even when pre-existing instability was minimal. So, as ever, historical content is likely the key to understanding how climate can impact a society. It's also clear that we should be preparing for the impacts of the next big eruption. So far in the 20th century and 21st centuries, the eruptions we've experienced have been minnows compared to some that these dynasties had to deal with. Zhao Gao, assistant professor, Zhejiang University, China, co-authored the research, and he said, "This study tells us how important it is to build a resilient society to cope with the natural hazards that we face, and be they volcanic, induced, or otherwise." This is from Trinity College, Dublin, on Science Daily. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support.